Welcome to another spine-chilling tale from Pure Brain Relaxation Sounds. Tonight, we invite you to step into a world where darkness and mystery take root, where an old farmhouse becomes a prison for those who dare to call it home. Claire Jackson and her family thought they had found the perfect escape from the chaos of their city life. But as they move into their new home, the shadows of the past begin to stir. A single cryptic warning is written on the walls. Never look out the upstairs window after midnight. A rule they choose to ignore, and one that will change everything. Join us as we unravel the terrifying truth behind the house's dark secrets. A place where fear is not just felt, but lived. A place where the past refuses to stay buried and the present is consumed by what lurks in the shadows. So, sit back, relax, and prepare yourself. You're about to enter a world of terror that will leave you questioning the safety of your own home. This is the story of Don't Look Out the Window. The Jackson family had been searching for a new home for months. After moving from the city, they were eager for a change, looking for somewhere peaceful, away from the bustle of urban life. When Sam Jackson found an advertisement for a secluded farmhouse, it seemed like the perfect escape. The house was affordable, spacious, and, most importantly, surrounded by nature. No neighbors for miles. It was a dream come true for Claire, who wanted to leave behind the chaos of the city. For Lily and Noah, it promised a place to explore, with wide open fields and a dense forest nearby. The farmhouse was tucked away in the rural countryside, far from the nearest town. The gravel driveway wound its way through tall, shadowy trees, their branches swaying in the wind as though whispering secrets. The house itself was old, weathered by years of harsh seasons, its once white paint now peeling and faded to a dull grey. But despite its worn appearance, there was something about it that drew them in, a sense of history, a sense of mystery. As they pulled up to the front of the house, Lily's eyes lit up. "It's perfect," she exclaimed, already imagining herself playing in the yard and exploring the surrounding forest. Noah, always the more cautious of the two, stared up at the house with suspicion. There was something unsettling about it. The way it seemed to loom in the distance, its crooked windows gazing down at them like watching eyes. Sam and Claire both brushed off their doubts, convincing themselves that it was just their nerves getting the best of them. The house was a steal, and they were ready for a fresh start. The moving truck pulled into the driveway, and they began unloading their belongings, eager to settle into their new home. As they walked through the front door, they were greeted by the smell of dust and old wood. The interior was just as old as the exterior, with creaky wooden floors and yellowed wallpaper. The kitchen was functional, with an old stove and refrigerator, while the living room was cozy, albeit a bit dated. The house was far from luxurious, but it was spacious enough for their family of 4, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a small study on the main floor. It had the charm of an old farmhouse, but with just a hint of something strange. That night, after dinner, they settled in for their first night in the house. Claire and Sam tried to make their room comfortable, arranging their things and putting up a few family photos to give the place a sense of familiarity. Lily and Noah explored their rooms upstairs, each one large and full of old furniture left behind by the previous owners. The air was still, and the house seemed to settle with a deep groan as though it were alive. Later that evening, as the sun set and darkness enveloped the house, Claire sat on the couch, flipping through a local newspaper she had found in the living room. Sam was busy unpacking boxes, while the children played in their rooms, It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of peace that makes you uneasy, as if something is waiting just around the corner. Claire looked out the window into the night. The yard was dark, save for the faint light of the moon casting long shadows over the trees. It was quiet, eerily so. The wind had died down, leaving the branches of the trees to creak and sway under the weight of their own silence. Claire shook her head, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. As she returned her gaze to the newspaper, she noticed something strange. A faint scrawl of writing on the wall near the staircase caught her eye. She stood up, moving closer to the stairwell. The writing was in a faded, almost illegible script, like it had been scratched into the wall with something sharp. "Never look out the upstairs window after midnight." The words seemed out of place, unsettling. Claire frowned, running her fingers along the letters. She wasn't sure if it was just a prank, or if the house had been abandoned for so long that someone had written it out of fear or superstition. She glanced up the stairs, her gaze falling on the upstairs window. It was large and old, with thick curtains drawn across it. There was nothing out of the ordinary about it, but the message on the wall felt like a warning, a lingering threat. From the house's past, Claire shook her head again, feeling silly for getting worked up over something so trivial. Maybe the previous tenants had been a bit eccentric or superstitious. Maybe it was just the ramblings of someone who had lived alone for too long. She returned to the living room, making a mental note to mention it to Sam later. But as the night wore on, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt too quiet, too still. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of life. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, as Sam and Claire lay in bed, they both heard a strange sound. A faint tapping, like a fingernail lightly scratching the wood. At first, Claire thought it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. It came from upstairs, from the direction of the window. Claire's heart began to race. She tried to dismiss it, to tell herself it was just the wind or the house groaning under its weight, but the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. Sam groaned and sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "It's just the house settling," he muttered. But Claire wasn't so sure. The tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. After what felt like an eternity, the sound finally stopped. But the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Claire tried to push the fear from her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding something. The next morning, as they unpacked boxes and began to settle in, Claire noticed the scrawled message on the wall again. She hesitated for a moment, then laughed it off, deciding to scrub it away later. She wasn't going to let some cryptic writing disturb her peace, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had taken root in her chest. That night, the family settled in again, but this time, Claire couldn't shake the idea of the upstairs window. She stood by it for a moment, staring into the darkness outside. A faint light flickered in the distance, but it was too far to make out any details. The house seemed to breathe around her, the wood creaking in response to the stillness. Sam came upstairs to check on her. "You okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. "Just thinking," she said, her voice shaky, "about the message on the wall. You don't think it means anything, do you?" Sam shrugged, still half asleep. "Probably just a joke. Some prank from the previous owners. Don't worry about it." Claire looked out the window one last time, feeling the weight of the night pressing in around her. The rule, the message, the tap in it, all felt like more than just a coincidence. But for now, she decided to ignore it, chalking it up to the overactive imagination that often came with a new house. Little did Claire know, that night would be the first of many when the house would make its presence known. The rule, the warning scrawled on the wall, was not just a superstition, it was a warning. And if they weren't careful, it would be the last thing they ever saw. The first night in the farmhouse had been filled with a mixture of excitement and unease. The Jackson family had spent most of the day unpacking, arranging their furniture, and settling into their new home. They were exhausted, but Claire and Sam were determined to make the most of their fresh start. The kids were thrilled by the new surroundings, even if Noah had expressed his reservations about the house. As night descended upon the farmhouse, a quiet calm settled over the household. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the creak of old wood. The house seemed to be breathing, settling deeper into the earth as it had for years before their arrival. But even in the midst of the silence, something about the place felt off. Claire lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Sam was already snoring softly beside her, his deep breaths a steady rhythm in the quiet room. The darkness outside seemed endless, stretching over the rolling fields, and though the house was still and peaceful, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Her mind kept wandering back to the strange message on the wall, the warning that had been scribbled out with jagged, desperate strokes. Never look out the upstairs window after midnight. It lingered in her thoughts like a whisper, and she couldn't understand why it unsettled her so deeply, after what seemed like an eternity. Claire's eyes finally began to flutter shut, but then, just as she was about to fall into a deep sleep, a sudden noise pierced the stillness. It was faint at first, like something scraping against the wood. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, its beams creaking and groaning under the weight of age. But as the sound continued, it became more distinct: tap, 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 rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from somewhere upstairs. Claire's eyes shot open. The room was pitch black, and Sam was still asleep beside her, completely unaware. She listened intently, her heart beginning to pound. The sound continued, unmistakable now. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the house, the quiet intensity of it making her skin crawl. Claire's pulse quickened as she considered getting up to investigate. But the last time she had checked the upstairs window, the eerie, glowing light outside had unsettled her. And the message on the wall, could it be true? Was there something dangerous about that window? Her gaze drifted to the shadows in the corner of the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned away, trying to shake off the feeling. The tapping continued. She felt paralyzed, her body refusing to move, but her mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing the sound. Was it an animal, a branch scratching against the window, or something else, something far worse? Suddenly, Lily's voice broke. Through the tension, "Mum," she whispered from the doorway. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly sat up, realizing she had been holding her breath. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice calm. She turned on the lamp next to the bed, casting a soft glow across the room. Lily stepped into the room, her face pale and filled with fear. "I heard it," she said in a trembling voice. "The tapping, it's coming from the window." Claire's stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "I thought I was imagining it, but I heard it too. It's like someone is out there, trying to get in." Sam groggily woke up at the sound of Claire's voice. He rubbed his eyes and looked at his daughter. "What's going on?" he asked, clearly annoyed at being woken so abruptly. But when he saw the fear on Lily's face, his expression softened. "It's the tapping," Claire said, her voice strained. "It's coming from upstairs, just like before." Sam let out a deep sigh. "It's just the house settling, Claire. We've been through this already." But Claire wasn't convinced. She stared at the bedroom door, her mind swirling with thoughts of the message on the wall. She could hear the faint scratching noise again, coming from above. This time, it was louder, more pronounced. "I'm going to check it out," Claire said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled. "No, wait," Sam said, reaching out to stop her. "It's nothing. You don't need to go up there." But Claire was already out of bed. She had to know what was causing the noise, even if it meant confronting whatever this house was hiding upstairs. The air was colder than it had been earlier. The house creaked and groaned with every step they took as they ascended the narrow staircase. Sam followed Claire reluctantly as Lily and Noah stood at the bottom of the stairs. Watching anxiously, Claire led the way, her eyes darting round. The dark hallway, the door to the room with the mysterious window was just ahead. As she approached it, the sound intensified. Tap, 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 her heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated before reaching for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. With a quick motion, she twisted it and opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been before, with thick curtains drawn across the window. The faint glow from outside illuminated the edges of the curtains, but there was nothing visibly strange. Claire stepped into the room, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sound of the tapping was deafening now, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. She glanced around, her eyes searching the room for any sign of movement, and then, for the briefest moment, she saw a dark shape just outside the window, moving. It was too quick for her to make out clearly, but there was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tap, 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 tap. Claire froze. The tapping continued, but now it seemed to come from somewhere else closer, as if something or someone was just outside the window, trying to get in. She stepped back, her heart racing. "Sam, ... Something's out there," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Sam, who had been standing in the doorway, looked at her in disbelief. "What do you mean, something's out there?" But as Claire turned to him, the tapping stopped. A sudden, unnatural silence filled the room. It was as though the entire house was holding its breath. "Maybe we should go back downstairs," Sam said, his voice now laced with concerns. They made their way back down the stairs. The feeling of dread grew heavier. The house felt colder, darker, and the once welcoming atmosphere had shifted into something far more oppressive. The warning on the wall seemed more real now than ever before. Tried to shake off the fear, but the image of that shape outside the window lingered in her mind. Something was wrong with this house. She wasn't sure what, but she was certain it wasn't just the wind or her imagination. There was something or someone out there, and it wasn't going away. As the family settled back into bed, the house seemed to settle too, but the unease remained thick in the air. And as Claire lay awake in the darkness, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the rule wasn't just a superstition? What if the warning was real? The night following the strange tapping was filled with restless energy. Claire lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of the mysterious figures outside the window and the unsettling message written on the wall. Sam had tried to reassure her, dismissing everything as coincidence, as the house simply settling. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much darker lurking beneath the surface. By morning, the unsettling night had left a deep impression on Claire, and though she tried to carry on with the day, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sam, on the other hand, seemed to brush it off. He was more practical, more grounded, and the idea of strange supernatural forces playing a part in their lives seemed far-fetched to him. The kids, Lily and Noah, were excited about their news. They explored the yard, finding new places to run and hide among the tall grass and dense woods. To them, the farmhouse was still an adventure, an escape from the noise and chaos of the city. But Claire couldn't shake the dread that seemed to follow her everywhere she went in the house. The rooms felt colder now, the shadows deeper, and the air seemed to hang heavy with something unspoken that night. After a quiet dinner, the family settled in for their second evening in the house. The kids were upstairs, in their rooms, unpacking their belongings and getting ready for bed. Sam and Claire sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "I think we should leave," Claire said quietly, breaking the silence between them. She hadn't wanted to bring it up, but the words felt like they needed to be spoken. Sam looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Leave? Why? We've just gotten here." "I know, but there's something wrong with this place, Sam. I can feel it. The tapping last night, the feeling of being watched, the message on the wall, it's all too much." Sam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, it's just an old house. These things happen. It's probably nothing." "You didn't hear it, Sam," Claire said, her voice trembling. "The tapping, the figures outside, it's like the house is trying to tell us something. And I don't think it's something good." Sam looked at her for a moment, his expression softening. He understood her fears, he really did, but he also knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. "We can't keep running from every little thing that scares us, Claire. We're not going to let this place control us. If we keep looking over our shoulder, we'll never feel at peace." Claire hesitated, but something in Sam's voice made her pause. He was right. They couldn't live in fear. But the warning on the wall, the tapping, the way the house seemed to breathe, it was becoming harder to ignore. "Maybe you're right," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll try to get some sleep." Sam kissed her forehead gently, then stood up and walked toward the stairs. "I'll check on the kids." Claire sat there for a moment longer, her eyes darting toward the stairs. She knew Sam was doing his best to comfort her, but something inside her told her that ignoring the rule would come at a price. Late that night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't help herself. The darkness outside felt heavier than before, suffocating her, wrapping around her like a cold blanket. The house was silent to silent hand. Claire found her eyes drifting toward the window. Her breath caught in her throat. The window, covered by thick curtains, beckoned her. Something about it felt alive, like it was daring her to break the rule, to look. The warning had been clear: never look out the upstairs window after midnight. But the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Was it just a superstition, or was there something real behind it? Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a psychological game played by the house to make them feel paranoid. She had to know. With a deep breath, Claire swung her legs out of bed, the cold floor biting at her feet as she stood. Her heart raced as she walked toward the window, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounding louder with every step. The air felt thick, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. She reached the window and paused, her hand resting on the curtain. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, and her thoughts were a tangled mess. What if the message on the wall was right? What if looking out that window would unleash something terrible? But the temptation was too strong. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had to look, that the truth was out there. Just beyond the curtain, with trembling fingers, she drew the curtain aside, revealing the dark landscape outside. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the empty yard. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches like twisted fingers reaching toward the house. For a moment, nothing happened. Claire stood there, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to reveal itself, and then she saw it in the distance, just at the edge of the woods. A figure stood. It was tall, too tall, its shape indistinct in the shadows. The figure didn't move, but Claire could feel its presence watching, waiting, her breath hitched in her throat. She tried to look away, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the figure was pulling her in, keeping her locked in place with its silent gaze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could feel the weight of something dark pressing down on her chest suddenly. The figure took a step forward, and Claire's heart stopped. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like something from a nightmare. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the night. Claire stumbled back, her breath shallow, her body trembling. She quickly pulled the curtain shut, but the image of the figure remained burned into her mind. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and she felt as though she were drowning. She had seen it. The thing outside, the thing that the house had been hiding. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. It was real. The next morning, Claire was a wreck. She hadn't slept a wink, her eyes redrimmed from hours of staring into the darkness, waiting for the figure to return. Sam had woken up to find her in a state of panic, shaking and unable to speak coherently. It took her hours to gather enough strength to explain what had happened. Sam listened carefully, trying to understand, but his skepticism was evident. It's probably just the stress of the move, Claire. You've been through a lot. We're all adjusting. But Claire couldn't shake the image of that tall figure, the way it had stared at her from the edge of the woods. It was no illusion. It was no dream. It was real, and it was watching them. I'm telling you, Sam, Claire said, her voice trembling. We're not alone here. The house site's alive, and whatever that thing was, it's waiting for us. The events of the previous night had shaken Claire to her core. She had seen something she couldn't explain, something that was lurking just outside the window of the farmhouse. No matter how much she tried to rationalize it, there was no denying the eerie presence that had watched her from the darkness. And now, in the light of day, the house felt more oppressive than ever, as though it were closing in on her, waiting for something. The following evening, Claire tried to put on a brave face for Sam and the kids. She didn't want to appear weak, to let them see how truly terrified she was. But every time she glanced toward the stairs leading to the upstairs window, her heart would race. Her mind kept replaying the image of that tall figure, its unnaturally long limbs, its unnatural stillness. It felt like something out of a nightmare, not a living thing, but a manifestation of pure malice. Sam, of course, hadn't seen the figure. He hadn't heard the tapping or felt the chill in the air that Claire could almost taste. He still dismissed everything as the house settling or the result of stress from the move. He kept telling her it was nothing, just a product of their imagination, but Claire knew what she had seen, and she couldn't let it go that night. As the family prepared for bed, the house was eerily quiet. The kids were upstairs, getting ready to settle into their rooms. Claire's hands shook as she tucked in Noah and Lily, trying to mask her fear behind a smile. She couldn't stand being away from them, not with the sense that something was lurking, something watching from the shadows. "Mum," Lily asked softly, looking up at Claire as she tucked the blankets round her. "Do you think the house is haunted?" Claire hesitated, her throat tightening. She had always tried to shield her children from fear, to keep them from feeling the darkness that sometimes crept into their lives. But tonight, the question felt too real to ignore. She didn't want to frighten them, but she couldn't lie to them either. "I don't know." "Sweetie," Claire replied, forcing a calm tone. "But we're safe here. We're together, and that's all that matters." But as she kissed Lily good night and turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness in the house wasn't something she could protect them from. Not anymore. As the night deepened, Claire found herself awake again, lying in the stillness of the bedroom. Sam was asleep beside her, but her mind refused to rest. The darkness outside seemed to swallow everything, and the weight of the house pressing in on her felt suffocating. She could hear the creaks and groans of the old walls, the whispers of the house as it shifted in the night. The tap, tap, tap of the night before lingered in her mind, echoing through her thoughts like a warning. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend it wasn't real. Claire's curiosity got the better of her once again. The rule, the warning, never look out the upstairs window after midnight, kept pulling her back to it. She knew she shouldn't, but she felt like she had to. She had to know what was out there. She stood up quietly, careful not to wake Sam, and crept toward the stairs. The house felt colder tonight, the air thicker with an unseen presence. Every step she took up the creaking stairs made her heart beat faster. Her mind raced with a mix of fear and anticipation. What would she see this time? Would it be the same figure, or something worse? As she reached the top of the stairs, she felt the air had changed, like the atmosphere itself was charged with something malevolent. The house seemed to be holding its breath. The door to the room with the window was slightly ajar, the pale light from the moon leaking through the crack. Claire hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her skin prickled, and for a second, she almost turned back. But she couldn't. She had to look. She pushed open the door slowly, her pulse racing in her ears. The curtains were drawn tight, but she could see the faint glow outside. She didn't even need to open the window, she could feel something out. There, something waiting. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift outside, moving as though they were alive. Claire moved toward the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled the curtains aside. What she saw sent a chill down her spine at first. It seemed like the same figure, the tall, gaunt shape standing at the edge of the woods, its dark silhouette almost blending with the trees. But this time, something was different. The figure wasn't motionless. It was moving, but not in any way that seemed natural. It swayed, its limbs jerking in an unnatural rhythm, like a marionette with broken strings. Each movement was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the very air dot. Claire gasped, stepping back from the window, but her feet felt frozen to the floor. The figure was now closer, so close that she could make out its features. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was hollow. The eyes were dark pits, empty and devoid of life. And the mouth, if it could even be considered a mouth, was wide and gaping, like a wound torn into its face. The figure's body was distorted, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted, bending at odd angles. For a moment, Claire thought she saw it look up at her, Its eyes, those dark, empty pits, locked onto hers. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at her, like it was waiting for something. Claire stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The room felt as if it were closing in on her, the walls pressing inward. She wanted to scream, to call out for Sam, but the words wouldn't come. The figure outside was like a living nightmare, something beyond her comprehension, something that defied the very laws of nature. Her mind was screaming for her to look away, but her body refused to obey. The figure outside seemed to pull her in, its gaze keeping her rooted in place. It wasn't just staring at her, it was watching, waiting for her to make a move. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, its limbs twisting in grotesque angles, its body moving toward the window with terrifying speed. Claire's heart nearly stopped. She felt her body jerk forward, as though something was pulling her toward the window, something beyond her control. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. In that moment, she realized the truth. This wasn't just a figure. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before they arrived. Something that had been waiting for them. Claire snapped back to reality, breaking the trance-like hold that the figure had on her. She slammed the curtain shut, her hands trembling violently. Her breathing was erratic, her chest tight with panic. She quickly backed away from the window, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't stay here anymore. She had to warn Sam, had to tell him what she had seen. But as she turned to leave the room, she heard the tapping tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside the window again. But this time, it was louder, more insistent, as though whatever was out there was angry that she had looked. The events of the night before were weighing heavily on Claire's mind. She had barely slept. The image of that grotesque figure and the feeling of being trapped in the house haunting her every waking moment. Sam, of course, had chalked everything up to her overactive imagination. He hadn't seen what she had seen, and he was still convinced it was nothing more than the house settling. But deep down, Claire knew there was something much darker at work here. The next morning, Claire decided she had to do something, anything, to understand what was happening to them. She couldn't keep pretending that the house wasn't alive, that the warning written on the wall was just a coincidence. She had to know more about the history of the house, about the previous tenants, and about the strange events that seemed to have plagued the property for years. Sam had insisted on staying home that day to help with the kids, but Claire told him she needed some time to think. She promised to return soon, and after kissing the kids goodbye, she grabbed her jacket and left the house, determined to get some answers. The closest town was a small, sleepy place, about 15 miles from the farmhouse. As Claire drove through the winding roads, she felt a sense of unease settling in her stomach. The landscape outside the car window was vast, empty, and eerily silent. It felt like she was driving deeper into the unknown, into a place that hadn't seen outsiders in years. The town itself was quiet, with old brick buildings and narrow streets that twisted through the hills. The air smelled faintly of wood and earth, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the farmhouse. Claire parked outside the local general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as she entered. Inside, the store was dimly lit, with shelves stacked high with canned goods, homemade preserves, and other old-fashioned wares. Behind the counter stood a grey-haired man with a weathered face, his eyes sharp and observant. Claire approached him, her steps hesitant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm new to the area. I was hoping you could Help me with some information about the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town." The man's eyes flickered with a brief spark of recognition, and then he grew silent, his expression unreadable. "That house," he muttered, more to himself than to Claire. "You don't want to know about that place." Claire frowned, confused by his reaction. "I don't understand. What do you mean? I've just moved in, and I've been having some strange experiences there. I wanted to learn more about the house's history." The man sighed deeply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't want to say anything," he said, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "But since you're already there, you might as well know the truth." Claire leaned in, eager to hear more. "What happened there? Who lived in the house before us?" The man's eyes darted nervously around the store before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house has been empty for years. The last family to live there, well, they vanished. No one really knows what happened to them, but I heard stories, strange things. People who lived near that place talked about hearing things at night, voices, footsteps, things moving around. There were rumors of the house being cursed, and then, one day, the family was just gone, left without a trace." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What kind of things? What rumors?" The man hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "It's not something we talk about around here. People don't like to remember what happened. But there were stories of strange rituals, of people being drawn into the house, of them disappearing. The upstairs window, especially. People say it's cursed. No one dares to look out that window after midnight. And you're the first family in years to move back in." Claire felt a chill spread through her. "What do you mean, drawn into the house?" she asked, her voice shaken. The man glanced nervously at the door before leaning even closer. "The house has a way of luring people in. It doesn't want to let go. The people who lived there before, they were obsessed with it. They tried to leave, but every time they did, they ended up back at the door. It's like the house won't let you leave once you're in." Claire felt her heart race. This sounded all too familiar. The strange feeling of being trapped, the eerie sense of being watched. She suddenly remembered the tapping she had heard the previous night. "The house won't let you leave. I need to know more," she said, her voice pleading. "What happened to the family?" The man's eyes darkened, and he leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "The last family, the Millers, they tried to leave multiple times, but each time they ended up right back at the house. After a while, they just gave up and stopped trying. They stopped talking to people, too. The house, it changes people. It warps their minds. And then one night, they were just gone. No one ever found out what happened to them. Some folks say they never left, that they're still in the house, wandering around, lost." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. This was no longer just some superstition. There was something real going on. Here's something dark, something ancient. The house wasn't just abandoned, had a history, a sinister one that had trapped its previous inhabitants. "What about the window?" Claire asked. "What's so important about it?" The man's face grew even more solemn, his gaze fixed. "On the counter, no one knows for sure. But there are stories, some say. The window acts as a kind of portal. A way for something to get in, or for you to see something that isn't supposed to be seen. They say, if you look out that window after midnight, it draws you in. And once you're drawn in, you can't escape." Claire felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. The window, the one that had been glowing the night before, the one she had been warned about. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man sighed deeply, his eyes distant. Some say there's a way to break the curse, but no one's ever been able to. If you're really determined to stay, all I can tell you is this: don't look out the window after midnight, and don't trust what you see in the dark. Later that afternoon, Claire left the store, her mind reeling from the conversation. The man's warnings had confirmed the worst of her fears. The house wasn't just haunted, was cursed, trapped in some kind of supernatural web that had ensnared its previous tenants. The window, the one that had drawn her in last night, was no mere architectural feature. It was a portal, a gateway to something darker, something that had been waiting for her family. As she drove back to the farmhouse, her hands gripped the wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. She had to tell Sam. She had to make him understand that they were no longer in control. They were at the mercy of something much older and much more dangerous than they could comprehend. The journey back to the farmhouse was a blur. Claire could barely focus on the road as her mind replayed the stories the old man in the store had told her. The house was cursed. The family before them had vanished under mysterious circumstances, drawn into the house by forces beyond their comprehension, and that window was more than just an old, dusty fixture. It was a gateway to something ancient, something dangerous. When she arrived back at the farmhouse, the air felt thicker, more oppressive. The sun had set, and the sky outside was an ominous shade of purple, the horizon fading into a void of darkness. The house stood as it always had, but tonight it felt different, more alive. As though it was waiting for something, Claire entered the house with a sense of dread, the heavy silence surrounding her like a suffocating blanket. She found Sam in the living room, reading through some papers he had pulled from one of the boxes earlier in the day. "Sam, we need to talk," Claire said, her voice urgent. Sam looked up at her, his face still half absorbed in the documents. "What? Is it everything okay?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the doorframe for support. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her body trembled slightly from the fear that had been building up inside her for days. "The house, it's not just some old building, Sam. It's something else. I found out some things today." Sam's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Claire walked toward him, her breath shallow. "I went to the store. I spoke to a man who knows the history of the house. He told me things, terrible things. The family who lived here before, they just disappeared. No one knows what happened to them, but the people in town say the house has a way of trapping people. They disappear, and the worst part, the window." Claire paused, looking over at the staircase that led to the upstairs room. "It's like a portal. Something comes through that window after midnight." Sam, seeing the genuine terror in Claire's eyes, stood up slowly. "Are you serious right now?" He shook his head, disbelief written on his face. "Claire, we've been through this before. It's an old house. It creaks. You're imagining things." Claire's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm not imagining things, Sam. I saw it last night. I saw the figure outside the window. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive. And whatever it is, it's waiting for us." Sam's expression softened, his voice growing quieter. "You're scared, I get it. We've been through a lot since we moved here. But this sounds like superstition. We're not going to let fear control us, Claire." She stepped closer, her voice growing more urgent. "I don't think you understand, Sam. This isn't about fear. This is about survival. We're in danger." Later that evening, Claire and Sam sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, that every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind was the house reacting to their presence. She kept looking toward the staircase, her thoughts consumed by the strange warning about the window. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just a relic of some bygone superstition, but deep down she knew she was wrong. As the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, Claire felt a heavy unease settle in her chest. She tried to focus on something else, anything to take her mind off the growing sense of dread. But it was impossible. The atmosphere in the house had shifted again, and the silence was suffocating. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, darker, and then, just as the clock struck 12, the tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her ears. She recognized the sound immediately was the same rhythmic scratching she had heard before. But this time, it was different. The tapping was louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from every direction, not just the window upstairs. It was as though the house itself was trying to reach them, to get their attention. Claire stood up abruptly, her legs shaking. "Sam," she whispered urgently, "it's happening again." Sam didn't respond right away. He had heard it too, but his mind refused to accept it. He stood up slowly, moving toward the stairs, as if drawn by the sound. The tapping was getting louder, faster, and more frantic, as though whatever was outside was desperate to get in. Claire grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Don't go up there, Sam, please." But Sam shook her off, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. "I need to see for myself. This isn't just in your head, Claire. Something's going on. Something we don't understand." Claire watched helplessly as Sam ascended the stairs, his footsteps loud against the silence of the house. Every step he took seemed to echo in the night, each one amplifying the tapping sound. Claire's heart raced in her chest, and she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, unable to move. The closer Sam got to the upstairs room, the louder the tapping became, until it felt like the entire house was shaking. Claire heard Sam call out from upstairs, "Claire, come up here. You need to see this." Claire's heart stopped. Sam's voice was strained, panicked. She rushed up the stairs, her body trembling as she reached the top. She could hear him pacing back and forth, the sound of his feet shuffling across the floor. When she reached the door to the room with the window, she saw him standing there, staring out into the night. "Sam, don't," Claire cried, but it was too late. Sam turned to face her, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to look, Claire. Look at the window." His voice was almost pleading. Claire's eyes locked onto the window, and she gasped. The window was glowing, not just faintly, but brightly, an unnatural light that pulsed and flickered like it was alive. Claire could see shapes moving beyond the glass, shapes that seemed to shift and writhe in the shadows. The tapping had stopped, but the house was vibrating now, the walls shaking with an energy that felt like it was about to tear the house apart. "What is that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The glow from the window seemed to draw her in, like it was pulling her closer. "I don't know," Sam said, his voice hoarse. "But whatever it is, it's not good. We need to get out of here, Claire. We need to leave, now." But Claire felt paralyzed. She couldn't move, couldn't look away from the window. The shapes outside were growing clearer, and she could see faces now, distorted, twisted faces, eyes wide open in silent screams. They reached toward the window, as though they were trying to break through, trying to get inside. And then, with a deafening crack, the glass of the window shattered, The crash of the window shattering echoed through the house, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. For a moment, everything stood still. The room was suffused with a cold, unnatural light, and Claire could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart. Sam, still frozen at the window, didn't speak. He was too stunned, too terrified by what he had just seen. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her mind raced, but her legs refused to move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the broken window, the glowing fragments that sparkled like shattered stars, and the horrific shapes just beyond the glass. Sam, Claire whispered, barely able to form the words. "What is that? What is happening to us?" Sam didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated with fear, and he stood motionless as if he had been rooted to the spot by some invisible force. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke, his voice ragged with panic. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse, strained. "Now." Claire nodded, her heart racing as she turned toward the stairs. She needed to get to the kids, to get out, to leave the house. They couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there. But as she moved toward the stairs, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet creaked, as though the house itself was protesting their departure. As Sam moved toward the hallway, the walls seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if something was closing in on them, suffocating them with its weight. It was as if the house were alive, alive in a way that it had never been before, live and angry, eager to keep them trapped within its walls. "We can't leave through the front door," Claire said, her voice shaking. "It's not safe. We need to find another way." Sam looked back at her, his face pale and grim. He knew she was right. The house had a hold on them, but he refused to give up without a fight. "We'll go out the back." "The kitchen door," he said, his voice more forceful now, trying to take control of the situation. "Stay close." They hurried downstairs, their feet pounding on the old wooden stairs, but the house seemed to resist them, each step feeling more labored than the last. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the temperature in the house dropped. Claire could see her breath in front of her, a mist forming in the air as she exhaled. The front door was locked, and Claire fumbled for the key, her hands shaking. "It's stuck. The locket's not opening." Sam rushed forward, trying to wrench the door open, but it refused to budge. The tapping sound that had haunted them earlier began again, this time louder, more frantic, as though the house itself was becoming desperate. The windows rattled, the walls shook. It was as if the house was alive with energy, dark, suffocating energy. "No, we can't stay here," Claire cried, panic rising in her chest. "We need to get out now." Sam, his face etched with frustration and fear, turned to the kitchen. "The back door, come on." They made their way through the darkened hallway, toward the kitchen. The house felt like a maze, the walls and doors shifting in the corners of their vision, twisting the very space around them. Claire could feel the house pressing in on her, as if it were closing its walls around her, trapping them in its suffocating grip. As they reached the kitchen, Claire noticed something she hadn't seen before. The back door, the one that they had hoped to escape through, was wide open, the door swinging gently on its hinges. She had been sure it was locked when they arrived, but now it was open. It felt wrong, like an invitation. "No," Claire whispered, stepping back from the door. "It's not right." But Sam, desperate to get out, moved forward and stepped onto the threshold, his hand grasping the doorframe. "We're leaving, Claire. We're leaving now." Claire tried to stop him, but it was too late. As soon as Sam stepped outside, the air changed. The temperature dropped even further, and the wind began to howl, rattling the trees outside. The door slammed shut behind him with an unnatural force. Claire screamed, her voice drowned by the storm that seemed to have risen out. Of nowhere, the wind tore through the house, sending papers flying and rattling the windows. Sam was standing just outside, but his face was pale, and his expression was one of pure terror. He looked back at Claire, his mouth moving as if to speak, but no sound came out suddenly. He staggered back, as if something had grabbed him. His body was jerked violently, as though being pulled by an invisible force. "Sam," Claire screamed, her voice cracking. She rushed forward, reaching for him, but it was too late. Sam was yanked backward, pulled into the air. The force was too strong, too unnatural. Claire could see his face, wide with terror, as he was dragged toward the house. "No." Claire cried, desperate. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling, but the door slammed shut in her. Faced with a deafening bang, she heard Sam's screamer strangled. Guttural cry and then silence. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen in the kitchen. The wind had stopped, the storm outside had vanished. The house was still, but Sam was gone. The yard outside was empty. There was no sign of him. She ran to the door, her hands shaking as she tried to open it again. This time, the handle turned, easily. She stepped outside into the yard, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. The house loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. The yard stretched out before her, quiet and still, but there was no sign of Sam. He had vanished into the night, just like the Millers, just like everyone who had tried to leave before them. "No," Claire whispered, backing away from the house, her body trembling. "No, no, no, no," but as she took a step back, something caught her eye. There, just beyond the trees, she saw a figure, a shadow, standing perfectly still. It was too far to make out clearly, but there was something familiar about it. Her heart skipped a beat. She squinted, trying to focus on the figure, and then, in the space between breaths, it hit her. It was Sam, his shape, his outline, but he wasn't moving. He was staring at her, his eyes empty and distant. Claire's chest tightened with fear, and she took another step backward. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling, but as soon as the words left her lips, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the night. Claire stood alone in the yard, the cold air biting at her skin as she stared into the empty space where Sam had vanished. Her chest was tight, the weight of terror sinking deeper into her bones. She had been separated from him, just like the family before them, just like those who had come and gone from this accursed house. It was the same cycle, the same grim fate. The house had claimed its victim. She tried to convince herself that Sam was out there, that she could find him. Maybe he had been dragged into the woods, or maybe he had run somewhere Rooney. Not back to the house, not this house. But as she stood there, the wind biting at her face, the empty darkness stretching before her, a horrible truth began to take root in her mind. Sam was gone, and nothing she did would bring him back. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she slowly turned back toward the farmhouse. She had to know what had happened to the people who had lived here before. There had to be an answer. There had to be some way to stop this, some way to break the curse inside the house. The silence was deafening. The walls seemed to close in on Claire, the shadows pressing against her, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. She moved through the rooms cautiously, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a warning. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness as she approached the old study in the corner of the house, the room where she had seen the warning scrawled on the wall. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. She had to find the truth. Claire moved to the shelf where a collection of old books sat, some gathering dust, others brittle with age. She ran her fingers over the spines, her mind racing. She needed answers. The strange symbols, the warnings, the endless disappearances. There had to be something here, some record of the house's dark past. She pulled a dusty book from the shelf and opened it. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age and time. But as Claire flipped through it, she found what she was looking for, a faded newspaper clipping that had been carefully pasted into the pages. It was yellowed and fragile, but the headline was clear: Miller family disappears, police baffled. By vanishing act, Claire's heart skipped a beat as she read the article, her breath catching in her throat. The story was brief, but it was chilling. The Millers, a family that had moved into the farmhouse just over a decade ago, had vanished without a trace. The police had investigated, but no evidence was ever found. Neighbors spoke of strange noises coming from the house late at night, and some had reported seeing shadows moving in the windows. But no one had seen the family leave, and no one knew what had happened to them. There were whispers, rumors of occult practices, of rituals performed. In the dead of night, the police had dismissed the rumors, calling them superstition, but the neighbors had never forgotten. They spoke in hushed tones, warning the new tenants that the house was cursed, that it had a hold on people, and once you moved in, you couldn't leave. The realization hit Claire like a punch to the stomach. The house hadn't just taken Samet, had taken everyone who had ever tried to leave. The Millers had tried to escape, just like she had. They had been trapped, just like her family had been. The house had drawn them in, fed on their fear, until they were swallowed whole by its dark power. She couldn't let this happen to her. She couldn't let it claim Lily and Noah. She had to do something. But what? The book offered no answers, just more questions, and more signs of the house's malevolent will. It seemed like nothing could stop it, no matter how hard they tried to run, no matter how far they went. Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the pages of the book, searching for any clue, any piece of information that could give her hope. But the further she read, the more she realized that the house wasn't just a place, it was a force. It had existed for generations, feeding off the fear and despair of anyone who dared to live in it. The curse had been passed down from one family to the next, and each time it grew stronger, more insidious. The only constant in the house's long, twisted history was that it had never been escaped. No one had ever left. The house always kept them kept, their spirits locked inside, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. But then, Claire stumbled across something different. The margins of a page, written in a frantic hand, was a note. It wasn't a part of the main text. It was a personal annotation, written by someone who had clearly tried to understand the house's curse. Perhaps even someone who had been a previous tenant. The window is the key, the note read. The house won't let you leave unless you look out the window. It pulls you in, but there is a way to break it. You must look through the window, not at it, but through it. Only then will you see the truth. But be careful. What you see will change everything. Claire's heart pounded as she read the words. The window, she had seen it glowing. She had seen the figures, those tortured souls peering through the glass. But had she ever truly looked through the window? Had she seen the truth it was hiding, or had she merely been drawn to it like every other soul who had lived here? Her mind raced with the implications of what she had just read. If she had to look through the window, what would she see? And what would it cost her? As Claire sat back, the weight of the book pressing down on her, the house seemed to grow heavier, the walls closing in on her as if urging her to give in. She had to act quickly. Time was running out, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep the house at bay. But she had one final chance. The window she stood up, abruptly, the book falling from her hands to the floor. She didn't have time to waste. She had to go upstairs, to the room with the window. She had to look through it, to confront whatever was waiting on the other side, to break the curse before it consumed her family. Her heart raced as she moved through the dark hallways, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was waiting, its breath cold on her neck. It was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move, to surrender to its power. As she reached the door to the room with the window, she hesitated. Her body trembled, her mind swirling with fear and doubt. But she had no choice. She couldn't escape the house. She couldn't escape its grasp. Lest she looked through the window, she pushed the door open. The familiar chill of the room surrounding her. The window stood there, glowing faintly in the darkness, its panes cracked from the night before. But this time, there was no hesitation. Claire walked toward it, her breath coming in short bursts, her body tense with fear. She had no idea what she was about to see, but she knew one thing for certain. It would change everything. Claire stood before the window, her breath shallow as she stared at the fractured panes of glass. The faint, eerie glow that had haunted her dreams for days now filled the room, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves. The same glow had called to her from the moment they'd stepped into the house, luring her closer and closer with each passing day. Now, standing in front of it, she felt the weight of it like the very air had thickened around her, a tangible force pushing against her chest. The book had told her that she had to look through the window, not simply gaze at it. But what did that even mean? To look through it to what? Claire felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast, something unknown. But she had no choice. If she didn't act now, Sam would be lost forever, and Lily and Noah would be. Next, the house had already taken Sam, its cold fingers tearing him from her, just like it had done to the Millers and countless others. The room felt heavier now, suffocating with an oppressive stillness. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing against the window frame. The coldness sent a jolt of fear through her veins, but she didn't pull away. This was the moment. This was her only chance to break free. With a deep breath, she leaned in, her face close to the glass. The world outside was distorted, the yard and trees warped by the fog-like glow. But this time, something was different. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the presence of the house surrounding her. She was no longer just looking at the window. She was looking through it. For a moment, everything went still. The air grew unnaturally quiet, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. And then, suddenly, the landscape outside began to shift. The trees, the yard, everything began to warp and bend, as if the house was rewriting reality itself. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just some illusion. She could feel the pull of the house, the power of whatever force resided here, dragging her deeper into its grasp. Then the figure appeared. It wasn't Sam. It wasn't human. It was something far worse, something made of shadows and despair. It stood just beyond the trees, its outline distorted, stretched, its limbs twisting in impossible angles. Its face was a dark void, a hollow, empty space that seemed to swallow the light around it. Claire could feel its gaze on her, even though it didn't have eyes. It knew her. It had always known her. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, but it wasn't from outside. It was coming from within the house, echoing in the walls. Claire spun around, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the walls still silent, but the tapping continued. Claire backed away from the window. The fear that had been building inside her now threatening to consume her. She felt like she was drowning, like the very walls of the house were closing in on her. She turned and bolted toward the door, desperate to escape the room, to get away from the window. But the moment her hand reached for the doorknob, she stopped. Sam's voice, Claire, it was faint, distant, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Claire turned, her heart racing. She was torn. Was it really Sam calling her? Or was it another trick of the house, trying to lure her in, to trap her? Sam. She called out, her voice trembling. Sam, where are you? For a moment, everything was silent again. Then, through the walls, Claire heard it. A faint knock, a tap. Then another. Tap, tap. Tap. She turned back to the window, her mind a swirling storm of confusion and fear. The figure was still out there, standing motionless, its presence more powerful than ever. But now, Claire could see something else. Something she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. Waiting for her to look away. Claire was pulled in her mind, torn between the growing desperation to leave and the overpowering pull of the window. She needed answers. She needed Sam. But the house was in control now. It always had been. The knocking came again, louder this time, almost like a command. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed open. Claire gasped and spun around, but it wasn't Sam. It wasn't anyone. The room was still empty. The sound of the knocking still echoed in the distance. Eyes flicked back to the window. The figure was closer now. It was no longer in the distance. It had moved, its shape flickering in and out of existence, as if it were not entirely of this world. Its long limbs stretched impossibly, its head tilting in her direction. Claire could feel its presence. An ancient, a thing that existed far beyond the limits of human understanding. And then, in a split second, she realized the truth. It wasn't Sam out there. The figure wasn't just waiting for her. It was waiting for all of them. Claire's mind raced. She had no time. The house was alive, and it wanted them, wanted their souls, their fear. But there was one thing she hadn't thought of. One thing. She hadn't yet tried. She turned, running out of the room and back toward the stairs. She couldn't let the house take her family. She couldn't let it take Lily and Noah. She had to save them, even if it meant sacrificing herself downstairs. Claire found Lily and Noah huddled together in the living room, eyes wide with fear. They had heard the noises too, the tapping, the knocking. The house wasn't just haunting them, it was attacking. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on them, as if the house had begun to twist and contort, breaking apart at the seams. "Mum," Lily asked, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Where's Dad?" Claire's heart ached. She had promised she would protect them, but now the house was coming for them all. Sam was gone, swallowed by the house. She had failed him, but she wouldn't fail her children. "We have to leave," Claire said, her voice fierce with determination. "Now." But just as she reached for their hands, the air grew even colder. The windows rattled, and a horrible screeching sound filled the room, louder than the tapping had been. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if something was about to break. Claire didn't wait for another second. She grabbed the kids and bolted for the back door. But as she reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in front of her. With an unnatural force, she couldn't open it. She couldn't get out, and then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the house. It was here, standing in the living room. Claire screamed, pulling her children closer to her as the thing moved toward them. Its eyes, or the hollow pits where eyes should be, locked onto her. It reached toward them, its fingers outstretched, impossibly long, clawing at the air. "No!" Claire shouted, her voice breaking. She pushed the kids behind her, standing between them and the figure. "Get away from us." The figure stopped. It paused, and then, with a sound like the breaking of glass, it began to dissipate, melting into the shadows like smoke in the wind. But Claire knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the moment when they would look away. The house trembled. It was as if the very foundations of the farmhouse were alive, shaking in response to the terror that now filled its walls. Claire stood at the center of the living room, clutching Lily and Noah tightly to her, her body rigid with fear. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the kind that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. Her heart raced, and her mind spun with the realization that they were trapped. The figure had come for them, and whatever power it wielded was far beyond her understanding. The moment she had feared had arrived. Sam was gone. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed the Millers and every other family before them. But she wouldn't let it take Lily and no other. Oppressive silence in the room was broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. But that wasn't the only noise. The tapping had returned, this time almost frantic, as if the house itself were becoming desperate. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, a dark, malevolent force that stretched across the house like a living entity. Claire's breath quickened as she turned toward the door. It was still locked, and she couldn't open it. The back door had been sealed shut earlier, and the front door. It had never budged once since they first arrived. They had tried everything. The house was keeping them in, not letting them escape. "Mum," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Claire looked down at her daughter's wide eyes, filled with fear. Her heart shattered. Lily was just a child, and Noah, still so innocent, didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening. She had to protect them. She had to find a way out. But how? The figure outside the window, the tapping from the walls, the whispers that echoed in the distance, they were all signs. Signs that the house was hungry. It wanted them, and the more they fought to leave, the stronger it became. She remembered the warning from the book. The window was the key. But what did that even mean? Look through the window, the note had said. But had she truly looked? Had she seen the truth? No, she hadn't. Not yet. Claire's decision was made. If the house wanted to take them, she wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. She didn't know how, but she was going to break free. She wasn't going to obey the rule anymore. The house had fed on fear for too long, feeding on her doubts, her hesitation. It was time to stand up. Turning to Lily and Noah, Claire grasped their hands tightly, her voice steady, even though her insides were in turmoil. "We're going to make it through this," she said, her words ringing with defiance. "We're going to break the curse." Lily looked up at her, her eyes searching. "How, Mum? How can we do it?" Claire looked toward the stairs, then at the window, and finally back to her children. The truth was clear now. They had to face it together. She couldn't do it alone. Claire took a deep breath and turned toward the stairs, leading Lily and Noah behind her. The air was colder here, the darkness more oppressive. The house groaned beneath them, as if it knew what they were planning. But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't. There was no turning back now. She had to confront the heart of this darkness, the window that held the key to the curse. They climbed the stairs in silence, the tension thick in the air. With every step, Claire felt like the house was pressing in on them, trying to push them back, to make them turn around. But she refused. She couldn't let this place control them anymore. At the top of the stairs, Claire hesitated for just a moment. She looked at her children, their faces pale with fear, but still trusting her. She reached for the door to the room with the window, her fingers trembling as they touched the handle. It felt colder than before, the air in the room heavier, thicker with anticipation. With a forceful push, Claire opened the door. The room stood just as it had been, but the atmosphere was different. The glowing from the window was even stronger. Now, the light pulsing with an intensity that made Claire's heart race. And then, through the window, she saw it again. The figure. But this time, it was closer. It was no longer a distant silhouette. It was standing right at the edge of the yard, just outside the window, its twisted limbs moving unnaturally as it stepped closer to the house. Its face, a void of emptiness, was locked onto her, its eyesore, where eyes should have been focused on her, with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. Claire didn't look away. She had to look through the window. She had to understand. With trembling hands, she stepped closer to the window, pulling Lily and Noah along with her. They stood together, looking into the darkness. As Claire focused on the figure, the world around her seemed to shift, the edges of her vision blurring. The figure wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside her mind, twisting and contorting, its form becoming even more distorted. She could hear its whispers, soft at first, like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. Filling her head, it was speaking to her, urging her to give in, to let it take them. It told her they couldn't escape, that they had already lost. But Claire fought against it, focusing on the truth, and then she saw if the window was a barrier, a point of transition. The house had been feeding on their fear for so long, but the figure, the entity, it wasn't just a thing trapped in the house. It was part of the house itself. The house was its prison, its vessel, and it had drawn them in, just as it had drawn in everyone before them. But now Claire understood. The key to breaking the curse wasn't to run, wasn't to hide. It was to face the house head-on, to confront the figure, to look through the window and see the truth for what it was. The house was a living thing, a thing that could never be destroyed, but it could be broken. Claire stepped back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping had stopped. The figure had faded, melting back into the shadows. The house, for the first time, felt still. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The window was no longer glowing. The darkness outside was just that darkness. But the house was still here. It wasn't gone. She hadn't defeated it. But she had seen it. She had looked through the window and understood its true nature. It wasn't over yet. But then she heard it. A voice, Sam's voice, faint but unmistakable. Claire, it was coming from downstairs. From the direction of the kitchen, her heart skipped a beat. Sam, she turned quickly, motioning for Lily and Noah to stay close. But before she could move, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the room. The walls began to groan again, louder this time, as if the house was reacting to her defiance. Sam's voice echoed from below, calling to her. But it was different this time. It was no longer just a voice. It was an invitation, a trick. Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey into the unknown. Claire's family may have faced their darkest fears, but the house, its hunger remains unquenched, ever waiting for the next to fall into its grasp. If you enjoyed this tale of mystery and terror, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories that will chill you to the bone, each more unnerving than the last. Remember, sometimes the darkest things are not outside your window, but within it. What will you do when the house calls your name? Will you look away, or will you look through? Until next time, stay safe, stay alert, and whatever you do, don't look out the window after midnight. Good night, sleep well.